On the podcast, we are honoured to sit down with George Hulse, a decorated Vietnam War veteran, author and speaker. George served on the front lines of what was one of the most harrowing conflicts of the 20th century and brings with him not only stories of bravery and brotherhood, but deep reflections on the cost of war, the power of resilience, and what it means to come home changed. We'll hear about his time in Vietnam, the challenges of reintegration, and his thoughts on the current state of global military affairs. This is a conversation about courage, consequence, and carrying forward the lessons of history. George is 82. He's an Ironman with a political science degree. Welcome, George.
Thank you very much, Belinda. It's a pleasure to be here.
It is my pleasure to have you here, sitting on this beautiful lounge.
Yeah.
Now, George, tell me a little bit about yourself and your life growing up in Australia in, will we say, the 1950s?
Absolutely. Well, yeah, my background is a rural background. So my fondest memories are that I grew up on first a sheep station near Crookwell in New South Wales on the southern tablelands, and then later moved to Camden where I did the rest of my growing up. So I tend to choose Camden as my hometown. And when I grew up to the ripe age of 15, I decided I should leave home and become an apprentice, which I did in painting, decorating and signwriting. And I found that absolutely boring after a couple of years. I needed action and excitement and travel. And so I joined the army at the age of 17 and I went into the infantry. And I love that because the infantry provided the opportunities to jump out of planes and go over cliffs and work off submarines and do all this sort of stuff. And they paid you for the honour of doing it. You didn't have to pay them a cent for all this excitement. And there was some discipline involved, but I knew what was coming with the discipline because my father had been a regular army soldier before me and he made it to warrant officer. So I was pretty well schooled in discipline long before I went into the army. But I loved it. And if I was 17, I'd join the army again and do it all again. But my first posting overseas was to Malaya in those days, now Malaysia. And my first operational work was on the Malay-Thai border, where we went out into three-man groups and we went looking for the enemy. And if we found sign, then we'd come back and tell our platoon commander and we'd go forward into ambush positions. And sometimes we'd set up an ambush for 2 weeks. We'd lie there without moving for 2 weeks, day and night, and we'd have a day group down in the ambush and a night group up in a rest area, and we'd very silently change positions day and night, hoping that the bad guys had come into it and we'd be able to kill or capture them. And that's one of the things about being a soldier. The infantry role is what tells us what being a soldier is all about. Is to seek out and close with and kill or capture the enemy, plus a lot of other things. But that's it, kill or capture the enemy. There's nothing nice about any of that. And you've got to be prepared mentally that when the time comes and your time to stare someone in the eyes and do away with their life while they're trying to do away with your life is one of the vicious things about being a soldier, trying to protect our country away from the dystopia of some of these other beliefs and world systems and so forth, such as Nazism or extreme communism. And so we choose to be soldiers to do those things in order that we can maintain our way of life. And for those that we love and those things that we love as well. So my first tour of duty, if you like, was in Malaya. While I was there.
What year was that, George?
That was 1962 to 1964.
Yep. And what were we doing there?
I was an infantry lance corporal.
Yep.
So I was the second in command of what's called a section of 10 men. Quite often I'd be the acting section commander, and a couple of times I was a patrol commander in my own right to lead a group of soldiers off into the jungle and go find the enemy or do reconnaissance work or that sort of thing. But it was during that time that my platoon commander, who was a lieutenant, said to me, George, you know what, you should apply to become an officer. He called me officer material. And that goes back to the First World War. Guys were officer material and got promoted.
You were a leader.
Well,
I can clearly see
thank
now.
Thank you.
People would follow you. People would follow you into the depths.
Well, the thing was that the army needed junior leaders, And the Australian Army was very good at looking at soldiers in the ranks and saying, you know what, this young fellow should become a commissioned officer. And we had a system, and we've still got it today. But in those days, we had a system where you went off to the Officer Cadet School in Portsea in Victoria, and you graduated as a second lieutenant. That's the lowest rank you can have as a commissioned officer. And you were allocated then to a corps, and you got trained into that corps, and then you went off and became a leader. And you were a second lieutenant for 3 years before you promoted to lieutenant. There were other officers who graduated from the Royal Military College, and that's an excellent college with great background where the officers would graduate with a degree. So they would do a university course of 3 years plus a year of soldiering, graduate with a degree, and they would graduate as lieutenants. So 2 pips. So we would meet with these guys and we'd all get on really well together, and we were, if you like, the backbone of the leadership going forward. So in my case, when I became a second lieutenant, I graduated into the Corps of Royal Australian Engineers, which was a great move for me. And on graduation...
What year was this?
That was 1964, December of 1964. And
how many tours had you done already at that point?
At that stage, I'd done 1 tour of duty in Malaya.
Right. Then
it became Malaysia, of course. Then I was trained to become a military engineer at the School of Military Engineering. It's a long, very intensive course. But at the end of that, I was posted to the 2nd Battalion of the Pacific Islands Regiment in Wewak, New Guinea. And in those days, we were at confrontation with Indonesia. So we had some real strife on the Irian-Jaya border. And it was our job to keep the Indonesians in Indonesia and keep our people safe from them pushing the border towards the east. And that was no simple job. And it was a job that went unrecognised pretty much because the Australian public didn't want to hear that on Australian territory we were actually loading bullets and ready to fight for our country, whereas our mates who were in Borneo, that was okay. They could fire weapons at the same Indonesians.
What do you think the difference was?
Well, the difference was that in Borneo, that was part of Malaysia.
Yeah.
And the reason why Indonesia went to confrontation is because they didn't like the idea of Malaya picking up Singapore, Brunei and Sabah and Borneo as part of Borneo as part of Malaysia. And they wanted to stop that from happening. So they had this confrontation. So they didn't want to call it a war, but it was nonetheless, you know, you threw grenades and they went bang and they killed someone. And the same as firing weapons at each other. And we did. In Borneo, there were Australians killed in action fighting the Indonesians, and Indonesians killed in action fighting ourselves, the Brits, the Gurkhas and the Malays.
And so that's where you were then. And then did you go to Borneo as well?
No, I went to Malaya itself.
Yeah.
And I've got a medal that shows that I served in Malaya during that time. When I went to New Guinea, that strife was still happening, and we were facing it on the New Guinea side, but we didn't get the same publicity as the guys that went to Borneo.
Did we have allies? Who was?
Yeah, well, the allies we had at the time were, of course, the British, the Malay people, and the United States of America. But at that point in time, things in Vietnam were starting to go bad. And the Americans were becoming more and more engrossed in what was going on.
And what year was Vietnam entered?
Well, that really started in 1960.
Got it.
And so we didn't get into Vietnam until about 1964, 65.
Okay.
We had some advisors go there, but the Australian Army, as an army, didn't get into Vietnam until 1965.
So they were keeping their eye on it, but working in these other areas.
That's right.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we were trained as officer cadets going through Portsea was the possibility that we would go to Vietnam as platoon commanders and get involved with the war there. And so we were all extolled to read a book called Street Without Joy. And that book is about the French Indochina War. That's how the French were defeated by the Viet Minh, later to become the Viet Cong.
And what year was that book set in?
So that was back in the late 40s and early 50s.
Okay.
So we knew that the French had had a hard time with counterinsurgency warfare.
Combat, yep.
From that time. And there's an amusing anecdote to this. So we were trained at Portsea, and one of our training areas was the hills of Hillsville in Victoria. Beautiful spot, but in winter exceptionally cold. And so we would do our machine gun pickets and our radio watches and so forth at night time, shivering away because we had jungle greens and not much else. And one morning it snowed on us, you see. So we thought, that's the secret. We go to Vietnam, we wait for it to snow, and then we attack. And of course, that's one of the reasons why we lost the war in Vietnam, a lot of us reckon, that it didn't snow. So it was never going to snow in Vietnam.
And nobody knew?
Oh, of course, we all knew that. It was a joke.
It was a joke. Right. Got it.
Yeah. So wait for it to snow in Vietnam. Yeah, good luck.
Oh, gosh.
So we all had a giggle at that, but we all graduated, and most of us anyway, I'd say the greatest majority of us went to Vietnam. So I came home from...
How many Australians?
About 80,000 all up.
And what was our... how many soldiers did we have in our Defence Force at that time? Was
about 60,000. So we had 9 battalions, plus all the support elements and so forth. We were a very potent fighting force during Vietnam. And that was only made possible by national service. So half of all our army was really, the fighting army, the combat arms in particular, was manned by national servicemen. Many of them call themselves conscript because they didn't particularly want to join the army. But
was there a conscription for Vietnam?
Well, the Australian conscription system, the national service program, was a bit different to any of the others. You had to win the lottery to be brought in. So if you were a certain age on a certain date, they would then have these marbles go round a barrel, and if the marble came out with the date of your birthday, then you were called up.
This is very much like a film called The Hunger Games.
Yeah. Very similar. Very similar. But not everybody, of course, made it through because they had to go through a psychological test and they had to go through a medical test and so forth. So, there were quite a few guys rejected because they just simply wouldn't make good soldiers.
And did they worry about the boys that were running a farm or running a business or an only son of a family? Was that a thing? Or were they called up?
No, everybody was called up.
Yeah.
But you could claim.
Right.
So you had the opportunity to say, I'm the only son, or you might say, I'm the only son, but I still want to go in.
Got it.
And if you said that, then you got the opportunity to come into the army and be trained. So you did your recruit training and did what's called core training, initial employment training, and then you were allocated to a battalion or a unit, in my case, the field squadrons of the Royal Australian Engineers, and you became a combat soldier. And even then, you were asked to volunteer to go to Vietnam. And this is the catch. This is a real catch, because once you've made your mates, and some are regular soldiers and some are national servicemen, and really you couldn't tell the difference between the two, and your mate said, well, I'm going to Vietnam, it was very hard for the national servicemen to say, well, I'm not going. So they were asked whether they'd like to volunteer to go to Vietnam, and the vast majority said they would. And they did exceptionally well. They were brilliant soldiers.
Step back a second. Tell me the difference between a soldier and then, what did you call the other ones?
National servicemen.
What's the difference? Is it reserves?
No. You see, now there's a reserve soldier.
Right.
And he is trained and equipped slightly differently to the regular soldier. Now, during national service, the national serviceman was trained as a regular soldier from the word go, trained, equipped and treated like a regular soldier. And a lot of the national servicemen liked it so much that they joined the regular army, even after they'd gone to Vietnam. So they came home and said, you know what, this is a better life than I had before I was called up. I want to be a regular soldier. So they joined. Not a lot of them, but quite a few. And quite a few went on to become promoted, and some became officers and did exceptionally well. The CMF, if you like, it was called in those days, Citizen Military Forces, or nowadays called the Army Reserve, were guys who were, if you like, bank tellers and teachers and policemen and public servants and others who had a job, had a family life, but wanted to learn about being military people. And so they joined the Navy, Army or Air Force and learned the skills of the sailor, soldier and airman, but still had a civilian life to go home to. So their training naturally was slightly different to that of the national servicemen, who did everything the same as a regular soldier, did exactly the same courses, but it took longer for the reserve person, Army Reserve as we call them today, to get the skill sets going and get themselves up to combat competency. But the reservist today is really well trained. It's got a fantastic attitude, and we're very proud of our, particularly the Army Reserve. And I served in the Army Reserve for 12 years after I left the regular army. So they're brilliant soldiers. They really are good. But national service is a totally different concept altogether. That's where a young person comes into the military system and they're given exactly the same training as the regular person, and it's just that they're in for a shorter period of time before they're released.
Right, 12 months?
It started out as 2 years.
Yeah.
Then it was reduced to 18 months.
Right.
But not 12 months.
Right.
So the idea was that you get the soldier trained as quickly as you can, and that's around about 6 months. He does a little bit of experience on exercise in Australia, if possible, not always the case. And then he goes off to the war. And the war would be a 12-month tour of duty. And so at the end of his 12-month tour of duty, he would then be discharged out of the system back to his civilian life. That was the theory behind it. And for the most part, that worked. But there were many cases where soldiers then decided they wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
They also had a choice. So when they were called up as national servicemen, they might decide that, no, they didn't want to join the regular army, but what they'll do is join the Army Reserve. And so they could join the Army Reserve, or the CMF as it was called in those days, and still give their obligation to the nation as a soldier or a sailor or airman, but mainly soldiers. They mainly went into the army. So in those days we had a very strong Army Reserve as a backup to the regular army. We had an exceptionally good regular army, very professional, very hard-hitting, good equipment, good training, good attitudes. And I think the potential of the Australian Army during the Vietnam War is far more strong than what it is today.
Yeah.
And so today our lads are being trained into specialist areas with light brigades, that's 2 battalion brigades and so forth, where they're getting the skills of flying drones and facing hardships and various things that soldiers do, and sailors and airmen. But the thing is that there's far fewer of them, and the threats that they face now are more perceived than real. And we all know that what you're facing now is going to be vastly different in 2 years' time. So it's very hard for them to be able to do if you like, a diagnosis of where they're going and then come up with programs that they know are going to be working.
Do we have the same size Defence Force now as we had back then?
No, nowhere near. And we have a problem nowadays with our Defence Force in that we're losing more people than we're recruiting. And that's a real shame, because the Defence has got a lot to offer young people. So I'd really encourage anybody that if they want to give it a go, do it. Don't wait.
The skill sets, the training.
Huge.
I mean, the camaraderie. And the other thing is, when I was a child, there was always the ads on television calling up for the Army Reserves or calling up for to join the Army. I haven't seen one for a very, very long time.
Yeah. Now, that needs to change.
Yeah.
And there needs to be an attitudinal shift in the general public about what threats that we're facing, that's coming straight down at us through the South China Sea and various other places. And it might be yet another terrorism thing we've got to face. Whatever it is, we've really got to be ready for immediate reaction, but it has to be very decisive reaction, not just a wet paper bag type of thing.
Do we have good people at the top right now?
We do, and the Chief of Army, I know him personally. He is an experienced soldier. And that's what we need. We need experienced people at the top end who understand what it's like to be operating in the middle of the night in the pouring rain, knee deep in mud, and still trying to get the job done.
Yep.
And particularly for the officers whose job it is get the job done, but keep your men alive.
Yes.
And that's a big ask, in a two-way rifle range, as we call it, shooting war.
Yeah.
It's very hard when you run out of luck. If your name's on a bullet, then bad luck. You're not going to cop it. And that's what I learnt when I came home from Papua New Guinea. I was posted to a construction squadron. We went to Shoalwater Bay and we built stuff. And then while I was there, I was told I was going to be promoted to lieutenant, and I was going to be sent to Vietnam into the combat engineer squadron.
And so what was that call-up like? How did you feel?
I wanted that. Okay. That's what I wanted.
So you were waiting,
I was waiting
for Australia to join?
Well, by 1965, we were already committed.
Okay.
And so we already had combat engineers. And the combat engineers who were in Vietnam at the time with the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment were a group of guys who were part of what's called the 3rd Field Troop, Royal Australian Engineers, commanded by a Captain Alex, or Sandy McGregor as we call him, an incredible leader, a very good soldier. And it was he who actually termed the name Tunnel Rats.
Oh.
And that's what we were. We were the Tunnel Rats. But it was his guys
in Vietnam
that went down the tunnels first.
Yeah. Who dug the tunnels?
Well, they were already dug
there
by the Viet Minh 40 years ago against the French.
Okay.
And so when we arrived, they had just developed and developed and developed miles and miles, several kilometres of, numerous kilometres actually, of tunnel systems under the ground, down 40 and 50 metres. And they had schools, hospitals, they had laundries, they had wells, all down under the ground. They could live down there.
I have never heard of that.
Oh, yeah.
In my entire life.
Well, they could put a couple of hundred people under the ground very quickly. In fact, they had thousands who lived under the ground. And it was our job to go down there and winkle them out.
So clear them.
Yeah. So part of the problem was that when we went down the holes, if they were hot, that is, if there was someone down there, you really took your time and your heart was up between your ears, thumping adrenaline, because you never knew. So you wouldn't have
went down first? You would have...
Well, we the engineers, the sappers, the tunnel rats, we were the first down those tunnels. But it was worth going down because we brought up radios, frequencies, names, diaries.
Intelligence.
All sorts of intelligence. And our intelligence community just loved whatever it was that the sappers brought up out of the ground.
That would have been key for them.
Absolutely. But the thing was that more than 90% of the holes we went down were what we called cold holes. So there was no one down there, and we knew it. And so you could take risks and you could do whatever you wanted to do. But if it was a hot hole, now you had a problem, because going around a corner was difficult, and then going down to the next gallery was difficult, because they normally had a triangular trapdoor between the galleries at the top going down and leading down to the ones lower. And they could be booby traps, so we put a pulling hook onto a trapdoor on a stick and we'd pull it. Yeah, we'd go around the corner, pull it back, and if the trapdoor opened, we'd have very, very powerful white light torches, and we'd watch and we'd listen. And then we'd go up to the trapdoor, and then we'd get our torch on a string and spin it and send it round so we could see the walls of the next gallery down.
Yeah.
But the other thing we wanted to do was watch very carefully, because we were told, and there was evidence to support it, that if you put your head down, they would spear you with this spike, which was bigger than the size of the trapdoor. So you couldn't pull your head up again.
No.
And if you went down feet first, they'd spear you through the stomach, and your mate couldn't pull you up either, because...
You're stuck.
You're stuck down there.
So did you see engagement down there in any of those doors?
Very few of us, I was one, did actually have a fight down a tunnel with enemy soldiers. But the thing was that it didn't happen very often. So it was more perceived than real.
Yeah.
But you never knew.
It was a real fear.
That's
it was
right.
a genuine
you never knew
fear.
if your next breath was going to be your last. So There's also a lot of talk about the booby traps that were down the tunnels. Well, in all the thousands of metres of tunnel that my troop searched, we didn't find one single booby trap. There was never a booby trap down there for us in Phuoc Tuy province. But what we did find was a lot of post boxes. And what the Viet Cong would do was they'd get a message, and one of the Viet Cong soldiers would know where the bunker system was, where the tunnels were. He'd go down, and they had to do this at night time, and he'd go down that hole, put the message in to the post box, close it up and camouflage it, then get out of the tunnel and go. And then somebody else would come up and take that message. And that was done deliberately, so that if we caught that Viet Cong, he never knew who was going to hand it out to. And if we caught the other guy, he never knew who had delivered it.
Yeah.
So that was deliberately done so they wouldn't contact each other and they didn't know each other. So,
what kind of messages?
well, the messages were about where we were, and that we were advancing in certain ways, and also any intelligence that the opposition had picked up on our side to pass on to the commanders in the Viet Cong or North Vietnamese Army. So we had two different groups there. We had the Viet Cong, and they were normally your shoot and scoot local force guerrilla, not that highly trained and not that well equipped and not that well supported, but quite dedicated to his own cause. And then we had the main force Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese Army soldier. And these guys were dressed in greens, they had proper webbing, they had proper uniforms, they were highly trained, they had hard-hitting stuff, they had good artillery, they had mortars and rockets.
They were ready.
And these were professional soldiers. They were really good at what they did. And they were determined. They definitely believed that we were a blight on their style of life, that we were Western decadents and they didn't want us anywhere near them, and we should not contaminate their families. So they fought like cornered rats whenever we met the North Vietnamese, and we knew the difference immediately. The first couple of shots fired against the Viet Cong would shoot and scoot. The North Vietnamese would shoot and attack. So, you know, we knew the difference between them within the first couple of shots. And this is where our junior commanders, our corporals, sergeants, our warrant officers were brilliant. They really were able to meet that sort of threat or meet that opportunity when it came. And the officers were trained from the Portsea days and the Dun Truong days that expect this sort of thing, because that's what happened to the French. It's going to happen to us as well.
So it's lucky you had that.
Well, we had
knowledge.
that as a background.
Yeah.
But we also had a lot of experience from the Second World War. A lot of our warrant officers and senior officers had fought in the Second World War in the jungle against the Japanese.
Yeah.
A lot of them had fought in Korea. Many of them had done Malaya. So when it came to jungle tactics, the Australian Army was really top-notch. Patrolling and ambushing was our forte. We really knew our stuff, yeah. And so when we compared ourselves to the Americans, they fought a totally different style of warfare. They fought a fire and movement warfare where they had buckets of firepower, and they would invite the enemy to come and find them and fight with them so they could use their firepower. Whereas we didn't have that sort of firepower, so we had to stalk our enemy. We had to find him without him seeing us and then hit him, and then he would react to our presence. Until Fire Support Base Coral Balmoral happened. And that was the biggest battle fought by the Australian Defence Forces in the Second World War, still that way to this day. It involved 2/3 of the Australian combat power in Vietnam. It was 2 infantry battalions with tanks and armoured personnel carriers, a signal squadron, an engineer squadron. You know, it was a pretty big, powerful force. But we had been given the wrong drum. And it was a bit of a shame that we had, because before we went into this operation, it was called Tuan Tang, which means complete victory, that our job was to interdict a lot of North Vietnamese soldiers who had attacked Saigon. And it was a gross failure for the North Vietnamese. They got done badly on that attack in Saigon in 1963, you know, starting 63 and going forward. So in our case, in 1968, when they attacked Saigon, they were really given a hiding. So the intelligence reports came back that the North Vietnamese army had copped such a hiding in their failed attack at taking Saigon that they were going back north in disparate groups, dispirited, disoriented, unfed, unwatered, out of ammunition, and they were going to be easy pickings. So send the posse out, round them all up, and give them over to the authorities, and that was our job.
And what happened?
The exact opposite.
Oh.
So
where did that intelligence come from?
Well, the problem was we received on the 10th of May 1968 an intelligence summary. And in that intelligence summary... No, the intelligence summary told us exactly what we were going into.
Okay.
But we didn't read it.
Oh.
There was one sentence in that intelligence summary that said, conversely, the enemy are going to be wandering around dispirited, looking for safe havens to rest up in. And our people read, conversely, they're wandering around dispirited, disoriented, unorganised. And so when our people were about to fly into Fire Support Base Coral, where we were going to put up these blocking forces, send out the posse and bring all the bad guys in.
Round them up.
Yeah, we landed into what's called the Iron Triangle. And the Americans called it that because they could never break in or break the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese out of that Iron Triangle. It belonged to the North Vietnamese, and we just flew into that. Now, there were about 16,000 North Vietnamese in the Iron Triangle.
And when you say flow into that, do you mean parachuted in?
No. So we went in mainly by helicopter.
Right.
But even that was a mess, and that should have told us something. And so there was intelligence information on day one that told us we were flying into trouble, don't do it. But we did it anyway. And what happened was that the two infantry battalion commanders, Phil Bennett and James Sheldon, were put onto the same helicopter, which is a mistake. Don't put two battalion commanders on one helicopter.
Bad call.
That's right. And they were going off for a reconnaissance to see where the battalions were going to land at Fire Support Base Coral and various other landing zones.
Despaired people.
Yeah, so they flew and they said to the pilot, who was an American pilot, we need to get right down and see where we're actually going to land. And the American pilot said, nope, I'm not going lower than 2,000 feet. And the reason he did that was because the North Vietnamese had anti-aircraft batteries, which would shoot these planes down. And the Americans lost thousands of helicopters during the Vietnam War. And so here's this helicopter pilot. He's got two lieutenant colonels from an Allied army on his aircraft, and he doesn't want to get shot down and lose both these. That's right. So he refused to go lower. Now, both of these lieutenant colonels should have twigged. Something down there must be pretty powerful if this guy doesn't want to get down and have a look at it. And so it was Jim Sheldon, the CO of the 3rd Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, started having misgivings about what was going on. But the other CO, Phil Bennett, Lieutenant Colonel Phil Bennett, who was commanding officer of the 1st Battalion, Royal Australian Regiment, thought, no, we're going in. So they flew back to their bases, and the 3rd Battalion's job was to go in and seize and hold ground, while the 1st Battalion and the artillery and all the rest of them all landed in and took possession of Fire Support Base Coral.
So how many boys did we send?
Well, initially there was only a couple of hundred. So most of 3RR went down and held the ground. And then there was another issue. Our lads were supposed to take off at 7 o'clock in the morning, the first group. And so by lunchtime, the whole Australian effort of the forward advance parties would be on the ground, dug in, ready to fight, right, by lunchtime. By lunchtime, the aircraft still hadn't arrived. So our lads are standing by waiting to go.
These American pilots again?
American planes.
Okay.
And the reason why they couldn't come was because they were supporting their own people about 5 or 6 kilometres away who were in a major battle with the North Vietnamese themselves, very close to where we were going to land in. That didn't tell anybody anything either. So late in the afternoon, in fact too late in the afternoon, our lads were picked up and taken out en masse. They had a beautiful timetable and a schedule set up, and very little of that actually worked. So at that point in time, the people at the top end should have said, whoa, tomorrow. We'll do this tomorrow. But they didn't. They said, oh, look, we've got the choppers now,
So
get
late
on
in
the
the
choppers,
day.
go. So our people start arriving, and they arrive in the wrong order. So the Australian battery of guns arrives in where it's a place where they weren't supposed to be. They were 1,500 metres away from the place they were supposed to land in, and all the artillery was supposed to land in one group. So we had an Australian battery of guns, 105mm gun howitzers, and we had a New Zealand battery of guns, 161 Royal New Zealand artillery battery of the same guns. And both the gun batteries were supposed to be co-located. One landed in one place, one landed in another place, but the New Zealand command group was in the wrong place when the New Zealand guns landed 1,500 metres away, and the American just said, "This is where we're going to drop you, get off the choppers." And so the New Zealanders did that. And so 3RAR, whose job was to look after the Kiwi gunners, came rushing back to form a ring around their gunners. So they were 1,500 metres away. They're
unarmed.
Well, they arrived and they can defend themselves, but their job is to fire guns in support of the infantry out in the jungle. So our artillery arrives. The officers get off, and one particular officer, Lieutenant Ian Ahern, we call him Scrubber. So Scrubber looks around himself and thinks, well, where's the commander, this major? Couldn't find him. Because when the major landed, he took off. But he didn't tell anybody where he was taking off to. So they had no idea where this major was going, and this major was in charge of forming a defended area.
Where did he go?
Well, he went looking, he was lost. And so Scrubber decides he'd have a look around. Now, remember, he'd been told that we're looking for dispirited, disorganised,
emaciated Vietnamese.
These guys are, lost and forgotten sort of thing. So as Scrubber's walking around, he sees at least a platoon, if not more, where they had dug in the night before. And then he picks up some detritus where the soldiers had, lost some gear.
What's a detritus?
Pieces of stuff that fall out of your gear. You don't intend for it to go, but it does. So he picked up what they call Ho Chi Minh lollies, almost like Chupa Chups.
Yep.
And they were fresh. He could have eaten it right there and then. And a couple of expended rounds, not expended rounds, but full ammunition rounds from an AK-47. So, these guys are well organised.
They're loaded up.
So he comes back and says to his commander, hey, listen, these are not dispirited guys. He was totally ignored. So another guy lands in, Captain Michael Bindley. Now, Mick is a good rugby player, and I'll explain more about him in a second, but Mick is the officer commanding support company of the 1st Battalion, and so his responsibility included the signals platoon, the assault pioneer platoon, and the mortar platoon.
So you had comms.
So he had comms.
Yeah.
But
the major had no comms.
No, he had comms, but he wasn't talking to anybody as yet. So when Captain Bindley is looking around to see what's going on, he finds a senior American officer about to leave. And the American officer came up to Bindley and said, listen, don't go looking for them. They'll come looking for you.
They've seen you probably.
Yeah. Oh, they were watching.
Yeah.
So Mick goes, wait a minute. This doesn't gel with what I was told about these guys. So he tells his senior, and he was ignored as well. So they had all this stuff that commanding officers couldn't get lower than 2,000 feet because of the anti-aircraft batteries. We got a lieutenant in the artillery, who's the gun position officer, finds evidence that these are fresh guys and they know what they're doing.
Ready.
And another officer, a captain, gets told that the enemy are very aggressive. They're going to come looking for you. And even those things were all ignored. And then there was the fly-in. So the last people to arrive at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon is the 1st Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment Mortar Platoon, under the command of the 2IC, Tony Jensen. He was a lieutenant. So Tony Jensen, and he has a very close mate, and it's Scrubber Ahern, the gun position officer of 102 Battery. And so they get their heads together and they say, well, where's the major? And the major said, oh, well, if you find me we'll form up a circle, as it were. And to find him, he popped smoke, and they took a compass bearing on the smoke and finally found him. And he came up with some kind of a plan that was not really a brilliant plan at all. So these two lieutenants decided what they were going to do to defend their area. And they only had 2 machine guns to do it. But the mortar platoon was put in an undefended position in front of the artillery battery. That is totally a no-no. And that's where they dug in. And by the time they had dug some of their mortars in, and they'd only dug about that deep for their own soldiers, night time came, and we had in Vietnam a thing called Stand 2.
2 metres? How deep would you want to be?
We wanted as deep as we could. And we'd want wire out.
And they only had, what, half a metre?
Roughly.
A foot? That's a foot?
Yeah, just what we call a shell scrape.
Okay.
Just enough to get your body and head underneath the ground, and not much else. And so that's as far as they got. So the artillery had an engineer bulldozer. Sepper Territory Stanton was the bulldozer operator. And before he was told to stop bunding the guns, that is digging a hole and putting a protective bund around the guns, he'd only bunded 3 of the 6 guns. So 3 guns were bunded and protected, and 3 guns were out in the open, right? No protection at all. And so that's how last light came on the 12th of May. 12th of May was Mother's Day in Australia. And there was a whole bunch of mothers about to get some knowledge about their sons they just didn't want to hear. And so they settled down for the night, and in the early hours of the morning, the North Vietnamese start with their probing. And they're just trying to find where things are.
And so probing means creeping forward?
Well, they want to know exactly where we are. And so they were after the guns. They saw the guns come in and saw the guns were not protected. And the reason they weren't protected is because as each of the companies of the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment came in, they were sent out into the bush, away from the fire support base. So now the fire support base had 6 Australian guns and a mortar platoon, plus some support company crew in there, and no infantry protection around them.
It's a headless chicken.
It just, it was a disaster waiting for it to happen.
Yeah.
And the North Viet saw this, so they decided they were going to mount a battalion attack against the guns that night. And they did. 2 o'clock in the morning, in they came. And they had 2 companies forward, which was about 200 men forward, and a company in depth, and their battalion headquarters in the middle. And the first thing they did was overrun the 1 RAR mortar platoon. They had 18 soldiers and 4 mortars. The lot were gone in about 2 minutes. But there were a couple of guys who survived it, and one was Lieutenant Tony Jensen and his radio operator, Private Jack Parr. Now, how they survived is a miracle of survival, really, because the North Vietnamese were over the top of them. It wasn't as if they were fighting off and there was a line.
How did they survive?
Yeah, well, it was a miracle. So what Tony Jensen did, he realised that he'd been overrun. So he asked for Australian and New Zealand fire to drop on his position. And nobody wanted to do it because no Australian wanted to kill another Australian.
No.
So he had trouble convincing people that he was done. He was done for. He needed to fight. And he had a choice. He could have surrendered, which there'd have been no shame in doing that. Australians have surrendered before. He could have run away. That would have been a little bit difficult. Or he could stand and fight. So he decided to stand and fight.
Stop it.
And he yelled to his men, shoot everything that's above ground because they're all enemy. No matter which way they go, they're all enemy. Have a go at them. And then he yelled out, I've called in fire on our position. Stay in your pits. Don't get out of your pits.
Yeah.
And so in came eventually all these rounds. But there's a little piece of personal drama in all this. So when the rounds impacted on the mortar platoon, it didn't clear all the North Vietnamese. So Tony Jensen, as a lieutenant, overrun, sees most of his men are either dead or seriously wounded, then asked for Splintex rounds to be fired at him. And a Splintex round is like a 1-inch nail, but instead of having a head where you hammer it into a piece of timber, it's got a fin like a dart. And there are 6,800 of these darts in one shell. And it's called a Splintex round. and it's fired from a 105mm gun in this case. And so what Tony said was, I want you to fire Splintex over my platoon. And he asked that of his good mate and his fellow graduate out of RMC, Scrubber Ahern. So Scrubber thinks, what? I'm going to fire Splintex at my mate, I'm going to kill him.
Yeah.
You know? So finally, they got clearance to fire and Scrubber had no choice. So he lined up his number 5 gun and he fired 5 rounds of Splintex straight at Tony Jensen's platoon. Tony Jensen and Jack Parr survive it. Everything else gets full of darts, but they don't. But the North Vietnamese copped a hiding.
Yeah.
And while they were doing it, the North Vietnamese captured one of the Australian mortars and fired 3 rounds out of it and then tried to run away with it, but they were done away with. So next, and of course 102 Battery now takes the full brunt of this NVA, North Vietnamese Army Battalion. And so Scrubber Ahern, as the gun position officer, had never fired Splintex prior to this. So he realised that high explosive rounds weren't going to work here. He had to fire Splintex. So he said to his gunners...
What's the radius?
The radius is almost like 180 degrees because these
5 metres,
fragments,
20 metres, 30?
Oh, a good 30 metres.
30 metres?
Yeah, it is deadly.
Wow.
It is a really cruel piece of kit.
Yeah.
And it's supposed to be 360, but not much flies backwards.
No.
It's generally going forward. But it goes off with one hell of a bang, and then you hear all the buzzing of these little darts as they go off at a million miles an hour. So he decides that the NVA are about to run over the top of his guns. So he orders Splintex to be loaded, and he said, put a quarter of a second on. And when they fired the first round with a quarter of a second, the round went off into the night and went bang somewhere down there. And he said, OK, put 0 on. So they clicked the fuses to 0. So as soon as the round left the barrel, it went bang.
In the air?
In the air.
So rather
smack
than
in front of the gun.
Reaching its target and then exploding, this was a launch and then explode.
Bang, smack in front of the muzzle. Because that's where the North Vietnamese were, smack in front of the muzzles of those guns. Yeah. So other bits of drama happened. So one piece of drama was that a rocket-propelled grenade came into the number 1 gun's ammunition stack and set it on fire. So they couldn't fire number 1 gun, so the gunners on number 1 gun withdrew with their personal weapons and fought as infantry with their personal weapons till the fire went out. Then number 2 gun copped a rocket-propelled grenade through its shield, and it blew the tyres out, plus whacked a hole in the gun trail. That made the whole gun unstable. But it was still fireable, so the gunners stuck to their guns and still fired this gun, even though it had taken a direct hit. So number 6 gun got captured. The North Vietnamese took number 6 gun. They came over the top and took it. But just before they captured that gun, the gun sergeant took the firing pin out, stuck it in his pocket, and ran over to number 5 gun.
It's useless.
Yeah, so they turned it round, tried to fire it, but there was no firing pin. Then number 5 gun looked like it was going to get captured as well, which was when they started doing the Splintex job. So in the meantime, Tony Jensen's platoon has been overrun and annihilated as a platoon. Mind you, there's still a couple of guys still fighting, and this is hours after their first attack. They're still fighting. There's another piece of, if you like, dark humour in all this, that after Scrubber had fired his 5 rounds of Splintex at his mate, he heard his mate call out.
What did he say?
He survived it. How could he survive that, you know? So they started shouting to each other, and every time Scrubber would shout something to Tony, this machine gun had set itself up, North Vietnamese, between Tony and Scrubber. Tony was only 30 metres ahead of Scrubber, and this machine gun would fire at Scrubber Ahern.
At the sound, yeah.
Yeah. So then Tony would answer, so he'd swing the machine gun around and fire at Tony. So that machine gun had to go. And so Private Jack Parr, who was nursing a guy who died in his arms, actually, and Tony Jensen then fired at the machine gun and knocked the machine gun out. While all this is going on, Tony realises that someone's looking down at him. And he looked up, and it was a Chinese guy. a North Vietnamese army officer, but he reckoned he was a Chinese fellow because he was dressed differently.
Yeah.
So he played dead.
Yeah.
And the Chinese officer was looking down at him, then walked away, and Tony shot him dead. But when they went up next day, they found he had a different sort of weapon on him. He was dressed in different clothes, and he looked different to the North Vietnamese. So they figured he might have been a political commissar, but he could have shot Tony no problem at all. Tony had one of his diggers who had cop one in the arm, and he was numb, and he was sitting on the edge of his shell scrape when a North Vietnamese soldier got in front of him with an AK-47 and stitched him up, but missed, put all the bullets smack in front of his feet. And when the North Vietnamese soldier realised he'd missed this Australian digger, he went to fire again, but Tony Jensen shot him as well. So he fell in the pit with the Australians, saved this soldier's life. So this was the sort of drama that was going on as we were trying to deal with dispirited, disoriented, guys who we thought were going to be easy pickings. Meanwhile, out in the companies, they're being hit as well by the North Vietnamese, and they're having all sorts of dramas. So next morning, when the North Vietnamese withdrew, they didn't take the guns, thank goodness. They came very close, within a whisker of taking the guns. They withdrew back into their safe haven, and then the rest of us all arrived with our heavy gear, like the engineers. We had bulldozers. And,
so that's when you went in?
Yeah. So straight after all this.
Had you known this information you've just told me? So
no,
you know nothing,
we knew
George.
nothing of it. So we were at a place called Long Bin, and the American heavy artillery were there, and everything that was too heavy to come in by helicopter had to be towed by trucks and all the rest of it, which included the engineer squadron, were at Long Bin. We hadn't heard any of this. So at first light, we moved from Long Bin, and it was about 40 kilometres or so by road, into Fire Support Base Coral. So as we're driving in, my officer commanding, Major John Kemp, one of the most brilliant officers I've ever worked for or with, came up on the radio and said, look, we've just been told that there's been a huge firefight here between the artillery. We hadn't heard about the mortar platoon, the artillery and North Vietnamese army, and things have changed. And what's more, we, the 1st Field Squadron of the engineers, are not going to be going in as we thought. We are now infantry. We are going to hold a piece of ground as an infantry company. We're going to dig in and we're going to fight as infantry. And we thought, oh, great, great. So I looked out behind my troop.
So that's the point where you knew this was dire straits?
Oh, this was bad.
You knew that from...
This was bad. So we pulled into Fire Support Base Coral, and one of the first things we saw was a lineup of dead Australians, all covered with plastic hoochies. And we thought, oh, this is not good. And then we saw the choppers coming in and out, taking the wounded out, and finally they took the Australian dead out. And we were allocated a piece of ground. And then they said, oh, no, you can't stay there, you have to move back and move back again. So we moved 3 times, the engineers, until finally we ended up as part of the perimeter to protect our guns. So all the companies were brought back in very quickly. We formed a circle round the gun areas, and we knew the North Vietnamese were coming after us again. And they did 3 days later. But in the meantime, in those 3 days, this Lieutenant Tony Jensen doesn't go back to Nui Dat, even though he's been traumatised. So on the morning where it all finished, on the 13th of May, he lined up his soldiers, and he had 4 soldiers left out of his platoon. And he said to them, and most of them had been wounded.
From how many?
From 18. So he said, I'm sending you back to Nui Dat, where you can refit and, sort of get our mates out of your mind.
Prepare.
And you're going to look after Nui Dat, but you're not staying here. And one of the privates was Jack Parr, his radio operator. He said, I'm not going back. If you're staying here, I'm staying here. I'm your radio operator. You need me. So Jack stayed with Tony, and they completely rebuilt the 1RAR mortar platoon so that 3 days later they were a potent force when the North Vietnamese attacked us again, only this time with 3 battalions, not just 1, 3 battalions on a deliberate attack with Viet Cong battalions. We think there might have been, upwards of 5,000 or 6,000 of them hitting.
Versus how many?
about 1,500 of us in Fire Support Base Coral, and about 600 or more in Fire Support Base Balmoral.
And it was just Australians?
Mainly Australians,
yeah.
But we also had a battery of New Zealanders with the guns, and we had a battery of Americans with their big guns, their self-propelled heavy artillery. They call it medium, 155 millimetre, but they are really pack a punch.
Brutal.
Yeah, yeah. So the North Vietnamese attacked the Alpha Company of 1RAR and tried to break through. They overran one of the platoons and pushed it back. And their platoon commander, a Second Lieutenant Neil Weeks, then said, "OK, guys, fix bayonets. We're going to charge back and take our pits back." And they did. And they charged. But there was another bayonet charge by Australians on the morning of the 13th of May. And this was by Delta Company 1RAR. And what had happened was that as they were pulling out to come back to the fire support base, they were fired on from a flank. And so the platoon that was fired on went down to ground and started to put suppressive fire back onto the enemy. And the officer commanding of that company realised he had to get rid of these North Vietnamese. He couldn't just, run all the way back to Fire Support Base Coral and not do something about these. So he put in an immediate company attack. So he put in the attack, he told his soldiers to fix bayonets, and they charged. And that was the last bayonet attack at company level the Australian Army ever put in. But it was a bayonet attack and it was successful.
It was successful,
yeah.
Okay.
So they cleared the area and unfixed bayonets and then went back into the fire support base. They were allocated an area very close to the engineers, almost next door to the engineers.
Yeah.
But then we had a drama in that the engineers could go only a certain distance because there were not a lot of us. And my job in one troop, I had the right forward troop, as it's called, was to make a link. And this is normal Australian Army convention. Mm-hmm. You contact the unit on your right and you establish communication with them and you tie in your machine guns and all this sort of stuff for mutual defence.
So that's what they had you doing, that was your role?
That was my role in my troop, troop. I was the acting troop commander of that troop. Mm-hmm. So I looked to my right and there was no one there, just jungle. So I thought, OK. So I got two sappers. I said, "You come with me. We're going to find who's ever on our right." And we went through the jungle and without being challenged or anything, we arrive at Delta Company 1RAR and here's these guys. We didn't know that they'd just put in a bayonet attack. And they were traumatised. They'd lost 2 killed and 11 wounded in all their the night before. And so I came up to a guy and I said, "G'day, I'm Lieutenant George Hulse from the 1st Field Squadron. I want to tie in with you." And the guy told me in no uncertain terms where to go. Mm. He couldn't move and I couldn't move and there was a gap. So I thought, OK, fine, we'll leave it at that. So I came back to my OC, John Kemp, and I said, "Sir, we've got a problem. I can't go right, they can't come left. We've got this terrible gap through the jungle straight into the headquarters." "Leave it with me," he said. So he went up and spoke to the commander, and the commander gave his personal protection platoon, it's called the D&E platoon, the deployment and the defence and employment platoon, and he put his whole platoon into that gap. So they weren't happy about it.
No.
But they came in and they dug in as an infantry platoon, and so my job was then to tie in with the D&E platoon, which I did.
Coordinate with them rather than these other ones.
With the Delta Company,
yeah. So they were out.
So the D&E platoon then coordinated with Delta Company, and that closed that gap.
Got it.
But it didn't stop there. So my mate in 2 troop, who was the left forward troop of the squadron, was a good friend of mine, Rod Palmer. He was a captain, and he was the troop commander of that troop. And so both he and I had been assault pioneer platoon commanders in the Pacific Islands Regiment, which, not very many engineer officers became assault pioneer platoon commanders, but he and I had. And he was given, for a short period of time, the 1RAR assault pioneer platoon. And so what we thought, just for a laugh, we'd go around and see the platoon commander, a Lieutenant Les Myers, and say, "You know what? This whole part of the perimeter is being defended by 3 assault pioneer platoon commanders. Isn't that clever?" Mm. we went round to find Les. He wasn't there. He was still at his headquarters, but we met his sergeant, who wasn't a happy camper. This was the third time they'd dug in a couple of days, and they were needed on the engineer side because we couldn't reach Bravo Company. And so we stood at the edge of Rod's troop, and we looked at Bravo Company, and we waved to them, and they waved back, and we gave indication that we should close, and we were told in no uncertain terms that Bravo Company was not coming any further right. So, okay, back to John Kemp. Sir, and he rolled his eyes, what do you want this time? We've got a gap, it's now in the open country, our savanna elephant grass.
So what, a metre tall?
Yeah, at most.
Okay.
And the NVA will come straight through that and take the guns out.
Yeah.
The American guns. He said, leave it with me. So he went away, and that night we have what's called an orders group, an O group, where the major gets his lieutenants together and his squadron sergeant major and the sergeants and so forth together, and he tells us what he wants us to do for that night by way of defence and what we're going to do next day on operations. So he gets his O group together, and he comes back and he says that gap that the captain and the lieutenant looked at today, it's going to be filled up by a pair of dusters. Then we looked at him. Dusters. We thought dusters were the sorts of things you clean blackboards with, a duster. What is a duster? He said, look, you'll see it when it comes in.
What is it?
It's a tank with an anti-aircraft twin Bofors guns on it, 40 millimetre.
Two of them.
And there were two of them. So 4 barrels, but they were made to fire at anti-aircraft. But these had the barrels down.
Yeah.
So these two machines roll in and we look at them and there's no turret.
Can't be too accurate, right?
Well, we'd never seen anything like this before. And they dug these little slots with their own little bulldozer terrace at the front, and they waddled into it. And it was a proper tank chassis, but the top of it wasn't a tank, it was a turret with no cover on it. The guys had no protection or anything. They just had these twin 40 millimetre Bofors anti-aircraft guns. And so we thought, so much for infantry tank cooperation. I wonder what they do. We said, well, we've got 40 millimetre anti-aircraft rounds, but we got them set at 50 metres, 100 metres, 150, 200 metres, and we let drive. So one fires 1 round a second, and the other one does it, but they synchronise. So you get a round every half second going forward and going bang, and it's flak, but it's flak at waist height. Yeah. Instead of being way up in the sky shooting planes down.
Does it explode in the air, or does it have to hit something?
No, it explodes in the air of its own volition. Yeah. So they set the fuses.
Yes.
And they'd already set
20,
those.
50, 100 metres,
Yep. So we thought, okay, fine. And they filled that gap between the engineers and Bravo Company.
And one would imagine that flak would go a long way.
It was devastating. When the North Vietnamese attacked us and these 2 dusters opened up, it was devastating. And, of course, they attracted all the rocket-propelled grenades. And we saw these rocket-propelled grenades going, trying to find them. Not one hit either of those 2 tanks. But they did something that really scared us. And that is that once the fighting started, they fired everything. Yeah. They fired the lot. And then they cranked up their motors and reversed back. And bombed up again. And I swear to God, I could smell coffee. I think they were having a brew as well as a bomb up before they came back for another go. We thought, if the North Vietnamese attack now, we're gone. They'll go straight through that gap. But they didn't attack. They were so devastated by these dusters. In the end, we loved them so much that we said, can we have a couple permanently?
Yeah.
And, of course, they had to go off and work somewhere else. But they were incredibly devastating,
so
with their firepower.
Saved a lot of the Australians.
Yeah.
So many.
We were so awestruck by the firepower of these dusters.
Were you in that? How long were you on that tour for?
Well, that particular operation went for 26 days. And we took 4 major swarming massed ground assaults from the North Vietnamese. 4. 2 against Coral and 2 against Balmoral. So Fire Sport Base Balmoral was the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, and they took 2 massed ground attacks. The first massed ground attacks hit their Delta Company 3RAR, and we were asked to put in 2 minefields. And so I went forward with my combat engineers. We put 1 minefield in the left front, and Captain Rod Usback, another engineer officer, took another combat engineer team and put the right rear minefield in. 2 minefields we put in between the North Vietnamese and the Australians. And then what happened was that when the North Vietnamese attacked on the 28th of May 1968, they attacked straight through the minefields. The minefields did not slow them down one iota.
They just kept pushing.
They just took their casualties and assaulted straight through. And that's how determined and how courageous the North Vietnamese infantryman was.
Yeah.
So we learnt from that the conventions that we'd been told when we were officers going through the School of Military Engineering, that a minefield to have any effect needs to be about 1,000 metres deep. If you put 100 metres of minefield there, the infantry will attack through it and they'll get less casualties doing that than if they try and breach through it, because all minefields are covered by fire and observation 24/7.
Yeah.
So if they try and breach through it, we would have cleaned them up trying to get through the minefield. So they knew that. So they said our best way to survive this minefield, because it's such a small one,
Expand.
is just to charge through it.
Oh.
And that's what they did. So we thought, well, there you go. That's what happens. That was a lesson too late in the learning.
Yeah.
But we learned from that if we're going to put minefields in, they'd better be substantial, or they're a waste of time.
Yep.
So but by then our Centurion tanks had arrived, and I was one who rubbished the Centurion tank, right? Before Fire Support Base Coral, we were told, Centurion tanks are going to be used in Vietnam. We thought, what? There's rice paddies, there's mud. You know, when it rains, it's slush.
Yeah.
These things are going to go down to the bellies, and the belly plate's going to stick to the mud, and they're not going to move. They're going to be bogged.
And what happened?
And
they pushed through.
And, you know, when you drive through the jungle with a tank with a huge gun out the front, it's got a massive gun on it. How are they going to, move? There's trees. They're going to be useless. Well, as it turned out, in the jungle, the Centurion tank was brilliant.
So what, did it mow down the trees? Did it just mow them down?
It didn't even know they were there. We call them the tankies. You know, the tank commanders and their crews would pick a way through, and any minor bush would just be run over by the tank. It weighed about 55 tonnes,
what
fully
about the
combat
sludge,
loaded.
though?
Well, they seemed to get through. They did get bogged every now and again, but nowhere near as badly as we thought they were going to be bogged, or as often. But at Fire Support Base Coral, which is the first time we used them in combat, they were brilliant in the jungle, and then they went into Fire Support Base Balmoral, and here they were, 4 tanks facing off against the North Vietnamese army, a couple of battalions, and they let drive with these tanks. So they were devastating against the North Vietnamese at Fire Support Base Balmoral with the 3rd Battalion Royal Australian Regiment, as well as the diggers, who had no intention of withdrawing, and they were going to fight right up until the last man.
That's true Australian style, isn't it?
So it was huge battles.
Yeah.
And so we went right through that operation, and during that operation, something remarkable happened. And I've written a book about it, and it's How You Get the Victoria Cross.
Is that the book's name?
That's the name of the book.
That's the name of the book.
Yeah. And there's a reason why I've named it that, and I'll come to that in a second. So remember I said on the 13th of May, a battalion of North Vietnamese attacked
Mother's Day.
the guns and the mortar platoon, and did a hell of a job on them, but didn't quite achieve their objective in capturing all the 6 Australian guns. Thanks to the gunners, they refused to leave their guns.
Yeah.
Fought right up to the guys running over the buns, trying to attack them against their gun positions themselves. Remember, 3 of those guns were unprotected. They were out in the open. Yeah. So that was on the 13th of May. 14th of May, one of the companies, Bravo Company, which was next to the engineers, is told, go out and look for the North Vietnamese. Find out where they are and let us know. But only do it during daylight hours. Don't be out there at night time. There's too many of them. So Bravo Company, 5th Platoon Bravo Company.
Head out for recon.
The whole platoon goes out.
Okay.
And it's 2nd Lieutenant Chris Ford, a Portsea graduate, takes his platoon out. He lines his platoon up. He's got forebodings about this. He's not happy. And he says, okay, guys, they're out there. They're regular soldiers, just like we are, trained like we are. So don't assume anything. We're going out there and we're going to get ourselves into a fight today. So, make sure everything's all squared away. So, okay, boss, we're away. So out of the wire they go, and they patrol through about waist-high elephant grass. So they can be seen, but they can also see a long way forward. And they come up to a track very well used with North Vietnamese army boot marks and heavily used. So he decides he's going to move north a little bit along this track and set up an observation point, which he did. Nothing came. So he thought, I can't stay here all day, I have to move. So he picks up his platoon and they go south following this track. And they get to about a point where there's a whole lot of jungle in front of them. And so Chris thinks, if we go in there, get into contact, it's going to be hours for us to get out of there. So he pulls his platoon up, puts them on the ground and says, dig shell scrapes, which you never do on these patrols. But those boys dug those shell scrapes really quickly.
Yeah.
And that's where they had their midday meal. So while they're having their midday meal, a huge patrol of bearers, the people who bear logistics and administrative supplies, without any North Vietnamese army protection, blunders into them. And so the boys say, holy smoke. So they all hook into these bearers who drop all their loads and run away into the jungle.
That's what was in the loads?
Food, ammunition, radios, batteries, you name it. And they captured all that, but that wasn't his job. So this mob ran into the jungle, and Lieutenant Chris Ford thinks, I've got to go in there. I've got to find out where they've gone. And one of the things that tells you that there's problems in the jungle is when there's no noise coming out of the jungle.
What do you want to hear? Crickets and animals and wind and trees?
Whatever's in there. Yeah. You get a feeling that, if there's humans are in there, all these things become silent. They look, particularly in places like Malaya where you've got monkeys. The monkeys shut up and they look. And if you can see all the monkeys looking down on the ground, there's every chance there's a human down there. It could be an ambush. You don't go in there, you see. So Chris had this foreboding, and so he said, okay, we're going to go into the jungle. And they went into the jungle, and they got to a place where Chris decided he was going to set up an ambush position, which he did. And he no sooner set up the ambush position when the North Vietnamese Army patrol, a fighting patrol, came into it, and a firefight started, and the North Vietnamese immediately attacked the ambush. Now, during all this, the North Vietnamese, one of the North Vietnamese soldiers shot a bullet straight through the platoon radio. It missed the radio operator by a fraction. He was unscathed, but he felt the whack against his radio.
That knocked it out?
And knocked it out completely.
Yep.
So now Chris had no communication back with his major. But his artillery spotter still had his radio. It was faulty, but it was working. So they called in an artillery strike. This was the day after the artillery had almost been wiped out. So they got their artillery strike, and the North Vietnamese went away. So time was ticking by, and Chris Ford thought, you know what, I've got to make it back before the sun goes down. So I'm going to make a move now out of where I am, and I'm going to sweep around, and I'm going to come out into the open, and we're going to go back to Fire Support Base Coral. And when we get out in the open, it'll only be 1,000 metres, minutes away from getting back into the wire, into the Australian wire. So as he's coming round through the jungle in single file, one behind the other, he spots this copse of trees, and he thinks, you know what? This is not good karma.
Something's in there.
Yeah, I don't like this at all. So he stops his platoon and he forms up something that I've never seen. And that is, he gets his 3 sections, and each section's got about 8 or 9 guys in it, under command of a corporal or lance corporal.
So from single file, he splits them into 3.
Into 3. And he tells his 3 section commanders, corporals, to form up an open arrowhead. You never see that. Generally, a platoon gets into open arrowhead, section, section, section. But this time he had section, section,
3 of them.
section. And he
Over
said,
what meterage? Like 10 metres apart?
They would have been about 50 metres.
50 metres apart.
But half of his platoon was going to go through the open area, and and one of his sections was going to go right through the copse of trees that he wasn't happy with. So,
God, you don't want to be those guys.
Well, these guys get moving, right? So they're in a V, and they get moving into the copse of trees. when they did, Chris picks up his platoon headquarters, moves forward. The right-hand section moves forward. The rear section starts to move up, looking after their backs. Next thing, Private Doc Forster sees a North Vietnamese soldier in an ambush position. And the North Vietnamese had formed up a lineal ambush. And the lineal ambush was designed to catch the Australian platoon in single file. So had he gone out into the open area in single file, they would have got a lot of them.
All of them.
But now the North Vietnamese had a problem because the Australians were going to roll them up at a flank. You never want to be in a lineal ambush while you're going to be rolled up from the flank. And that's what was happening with this section. So Doc Forster opens up, all the North Vietnamese open up with their AK-47s, and all hell breaks loose. So everybody hits the ground. Now, at this point in time, we've got Private Richard Norton, who's in this group that's going through the copse of trees. He sees his two mates get dropped, and he thinks, if I go forward now, I've got every chance of getting them out of there. So he had his very close mate, he's had a nickname of Cowboy. He was the forward scout, and the section commander was a Lance Corporal, Joe Kelly. He was behind, and both of them got shot full of holes, so they both dropped where they were. So Richard Norton comes up to a machine gunner, a fellow named Stan Barrett, huge soldier, and he says to Stan, cover me, I'm going to go forward and see if I can get Joe back. So Stan, being in the jungle, had to come up on his knee with his M60 machine gun and let drive. And of course he drew all the crabs because the moment a machine gun opens fire, the enemy wants to negate you. But next thing, Richard Norton runs to his front, so he has to keep an eye on Richard so he doesn't shoot Richard. And Richard's firing his M16 rifle, runs out of ammunition, but shoots a North Vietnamese soldier and grabs his AK-47.
Yeah.
Fires it into the ambush. A North Vietnamese soldier threw a grenade at him, hit him with the grenade up the top of his legs and into his buttocks, really ripped him up, but didn't break any bones. And Richard looks down, and Joe Kelly, although he's full of holes, is still alive.
Oh.
So he grabs Joe with an AK-47 in his hand.
And a hole in his bum and legs.
And he's bleeding profusely, picks up Joe Kelly and half drags him, half carries him back to Stan Barrett and says, look after Joe.
My mate.
Stan, yeah, all right. So now the section commander's knocked out. He can't command a thing. The artillery radio operator's pinned down with his radio that's not working that well. And so Stan decided he was going to take command. He's a private, right? Regular soldier, but he's a private. So he says to his number two, you take over the machine gun. Richard then lines up another weapon and some grenades and says to Stan, I'm going forward again to see if I can get Cowboy out. So Stan goes,
Are you joking?
So Stan looks at Joe, realises he's dying, and starts to wrap him up as best he can to stop the bleeding. And next thing, Richard takes off again. He's bleeding and he's firing and throwing grenades. And he finally gets to Cowboy. That he made it there is amazing because they had North Vietnamese up in the trees. That he gets to Cowboy and finds out Cowboy's dead. He's gone. He had no chance. So he shoots the guy who shot Cowboy and threw more grenades at these guys. Really does his block now, comes back and gets more grenades and goes a third time.
Oh, my God.
And throws grenades. And now the North Vietnamese commander realised he had to scoot. He had to go now because he knew the Australians would counter-ambush him and he'd lose everybody. So he took off. But he left his dead behind and he took quite a few wounded guys with him because the blood trails were profuse and into the jungle. So Richard comes back. And as it turns out, Joe Kelly lives. So Joe lived until about 3 or 4 years ago where he passed away mainly from old age. But he was full of holes and should have died. But anyway, Dick Norton saved his life. So they then send armoured personnel carriers out to pick up what's left of this 5 platoon Bravo company, Chris Ford's platoon, and bring them back into the fire support base where they got back into their platoon position, right on last light. So it's almost last light, and myself and the engineers are not far from Bravo company in about to get another O group from our major, John Kemp. And just before we went in and started our O group, all we heard was all these AK-47s open up about 1,000 metres away. And we thought, oh my God, that is not good. Whoever's out there is copping a hiding.
Yeah.
You know, and they were. It's 5 platoon Bravo company off the North Vietnamese. But then we heard a couple of machine guns open up, Australians, and we knew the Australians were fighting back. Then we heard the APC start up and roar out there.
What's an APC?
An armoured personnel carrier.
Got it.
And it had a 50mm cannon on the front,
Yep.
and they hooked in with their 50mm cannons, and the North Vietnamese took off. So these APCs, armoured personnel carriers, carried the whole platoon back in. So they're in their holes, and they've just been through one hell of a day. Every last one of them is traumatised. They're in their holes, and along comes Lieutenant Colonel Phil Bennett with the company commander, in those days Captain Hennessy, became a major, and they find Chris Ford, the second lieutenant, and here he is, just ordered his platoon to get the evening meal in because they were going to stand to, where you can't eat an evening meal, as quickly as they possibly can before stand to. And these two officers line him up and say, well, something really happened out there. We want you to write up someone for decoration. You write the citation, Lieutenant. So Chris turns to his sergeant and says, take over the platoon. I need to talk to everybody. So he goes around talking to everybody. And we have in the Army a thing called a beastie torch. It's a little torch that you buy, and it's for when you're in your hoochie, you go and find if there's any scorpions or anything of a night time with this thing. But the beauty of it is you can put it in your mouth, and you can use 2 hands, you see. So he gets his torch, and of all people, he gets into the machine gun with Stan Barrett. And Stan, what happened? Well, Stan's into it, you know, about what happened. So Chris writes up this citation, and he writes it for Richard Norton, Dick Norton. So he then gives it to his company commander, and his company commander looks at it and says to his another captain, Don Tate, a artillery guy, he looked at him and he said the words, "This is Victoria Cross material."
It is. It's 100%.
Yeah. How else can you interpret it? Yes. So the captain goes to his lieutenant colonel and gives him the report. The Lieutenant Colonel looks at him and says, yes, I'm going to put him up for the Distinguished Conduct Medal, not the Victoria Cross. So the captain was, but sir, you know, this is Victoria Cross time. No, Distinguished Conduct Medal. So this captain, the company commander, came back, and Don Tate described him as a rejected man. He was absolutely gutted that his soldier wasn't going to get the Victoria Cross.
Now, tell me, with the work you do in the Toowong RSL, how closely do you boys support the boys that have come home from Iraq and Afghanistan?
Oh, very closely. The RSL supports mates for mates.
Yeah. What about PTSD rates is super high?
It's super high, and all of us have got it.
Yeah.
All of us have got it
yeah.
in varying degrees and for different reasons. But that's where resilience comes in. With my PTSD, and I wrote about it, I'll put it on change.org so the whole world could read it, how I got my PTSD, and it visits me. So people say to me, you know, when were you last in Vietnam? And I say last night, because I'm there every night. I don't want to be there.
So
but
you
I'm
dream
there.
about it, George?
I dream about it. So nightmares are easy to describe. I mean, you've had nightmares. Everybody's had nightmares, so I won't go into that. But what you get are flashbacks, and not everybody gets flashbacks. And flashbacks take you right back into a time where I can smell the cordite, I can feel the rifle bucking in my shoulder, I can hear my radio, I can hear myself shouting, I can hear the crack and thump of the enemy rounds. It's all as if I've hit repeat, and it hits repeat every time, and it goes back to that time faithfully without losing any of its impetus whatsoever. But there's no warning of it coming, and there's no warning when it's going to finish, and I come out of it. And so my kids reckon I'm nuts, you know, when I go off on that. My wife asked me if I enjoyed my little trip, because I'm not there, I'm gone.
And you're awake at the time?
Sorry?
Can you do this while you're awake?
While I'm awake. Now, but this happens and I've
So
discovered...
you might just look, George, like you've tuned out maybe? Are you staring?
Yeah, I am staring. And apparently my eyes are flickering and it must be fairly
A minute,
scary.
5 minutes?
Well, it takes its own time. So I don't know whether I'm gone for 10 seconds or 10 minutes.
I like that your wife is by your side there and she's like, oh, you're back.
Yep. Did you enjoy your little trip?
How are you?
Yeah. And I don't tell her what I've seen or what I've gone through because it's really awful.
You would tell your mates. That's the mates for mates.
Now those are the ones I tell. So where do you get the resilience from this? Well, I get it from a couple of places. First of all, I'm married, I've got a wife and I've got kids and I've got debts and I've got responsibilities and they've got to come first, right? So any of the feelings that I've got to learn how to manage those. And we have Department of Veterans Affairs psychiatrists and psychologists who help you with that, and they're a massive help. Without them, I don't know where I'd be. So they are great helps. And I don't want to do it using chemicals or, medications that make me a zombie or something and put a smile on my face that I can't get off. That sort of thing I don't want. I want to do it, if I can, within my own skin and within my own head because it's all in my head.
Yeah.
My body's fine. It's my head.
Well, your body is... Your body and your mind and your head have lived with this for a long time
Exactly.
now.
And that's where PTSD resides. It's in your head, but it's a very cruel master. It's like a big black dog that drags you into a big black hole. And sometimes you look up and you can see daylight, but sometimes the hole gets smaller and smaller and smaller and you get into more despair and your adrenaline pumps and your heart beats and you go into despair and then you go into anxiety. But there's something else that helps you somewhere along the line. There's that hope, there's that resilience, there's that determination to make the hole bigger and bigger and to climb up and let that dog off you and look around the world and say, this is a beautiful place to be and how beautiful the trees are and everybody, and life is so fabulous. And that's why I love Ironman triathlon. Ironman triathlon hurts me and I need that hurt. It's because it reminds me that there's more to me than my head. I've got a body that needs to be looked after. I need to drive myself hard. I need ambition. I need to
This is
be
your
able
vessel.
to say, yeah, that's it. I need to say next year I'm going back to the Cairns Ironman and I'm going to give it a hiding.
Yeah. And you missed out by the French, what? By how long?
By 5 minutes. The qualifying time for the bike. It was a 180-kilometre bike race. And you've got 10 hours from the time you enter the water until the time you get off your bike.
How many kilometres is the swim?
The swim is 3,800 metres.
So you'll swim that, then you will...
Then you'll ride a bike for 180 kilometres, and you've got to do that in 10 hours. Now, if you don't do it in 10 hours, you don't qualify. And I missed out by 5 minutes, So, and there are reasons for that. But anyway... the reasons are nothing more, in my opinion, but excuses.
But the wind, it was the wind.
Put it down to the wind, and it was a bad wind.
Yeah.
But there were other things that happened as well. But that just makes me more convinced that I've got to train harder, I've got to listen to the coach better, and every morning when I get up at 4:30 in the morning and go off for a run or a bike ride or a swim or all of the above, that I'm doing things as well as I possibly can. And when it starts to hurt, that's good. That's pain leaving the body.
Yeah.
That's where, I want to be.
That's your day started. How many kilometres this morning, George?
Only 13.
Only?
So, well, you run a marathon at the end. You do a 3,800 metre swim, a 180-kilometre bike ride, and then a 42.2-kilometre run. So 3 marathons, back to back to back, no rest. And in Cairns, you get 16 and a half hours to do it, or you fail. So the magic words are, and in Australia's case, a guy named Peter Murray, he yells out as you're coming up the line and you cross it. Another time, he yells out, Belinda Messer, you are an Ironman. And they are the most magic words.
Oh, George.
And we live for that. And that's what I wanted to hear and I didn't get it.
You are a living legend.
Well, I love it.
Not only for what you've been through and what you still today go through, but this Ironman.
Oh, it's magic.
Incredible.
Triathlon, I recommend it for anybody that's able, fit to do it. and don't have an excuse that you hate to swim or you can't swim. None of us can.
Yeah.
It's only the surf lifesavers who can swim, but they can't run. So,
You can do one or the other.
Yeah, that's it.
And the Mates for Mates, is that...
That's an amazing organisation, and it's not just Mates for Mates. 42 for 42 and so forth, because we lost 41 soldiers killed in action, and the 42nd is for the PTSD guys that came home with the memories of all that. So there are so many groups that look after the Afghan vet. There are so many groups that look after the Vietnam vet as well.
Yeah.
So the RSL is there acting as advocacy for all of those. But DVA in recent times, the Department of Veteran Affairs, has revolutionised a lot of things. And this recent Royal Commission into suicides in the ADF has gone a long way to help the veteran who comes back from a war and is in real deep trouble. But it doesn't stop there, because we have other heroes among us: the police, the paramedics, the AMBOs, our doctors, our nurses, our whole hospital staff.
workers.
All those people see much the same as we did, not under the same trauma perhaps.
But pressure.
But nonetheless, it's in their head and they can't get it out, and they've got to live with it day by day by day. So anything that we derive as benefit from all these inquiries and so forth, we're hoping will flow on to the broader community, and they will gain the same benefit as we do when it comes to things like treating PTSD and this business about flashbacks and PTSD, nightmares and so forth. We hope it's not just us. It'll be the broader community that benefits from it as well.
How does it make you feel right now? So we've got Russia versus Ukraine. We've got Russia on the border of Finland. We've got Poland ramping up. We've got Taiwan and China. And now we've got the Americans involved with Israel and Iran. What are you feeling right now?
Not surprised in the least. It was going to come. We knew 10 years ago that Iran was developing nuclear-grade weapons. And the deal that Obama made with the Iranians was a case of, as long as you keep your nuclear to nuclear power, we'll help you and we'll give you all sorts of concessions. Just don't make a nuclear bomb. Well, the Iranians ignored it. And they're almost to the point now where they can deploy a nuclear device. And the first country they're going to smash with that nuclear device is Israel. There is no question what ground zero is going to be on day one. And their other enemy is the United States of America.
Yeah.
And we need the United States of America. We couldn't punch our way out of a wet paper bag if we were going to try and defend ourselves. We need America to come and help us. So the last thing we want is America to get devastated by nuclear devices fired by a rogue state. So I'm not surprised by any of this. This was coming. This was going to come.
So what about advice from you to the powers that be, the top of the defence in Australia? What do you want them to know from your experience?
Well, believe it or not, it's not the top of defence that's got the problem. It's that the top of our politicians have got the problem. What we've got to look at is, do we want to have, throwing all the lollies to all the kids for buying votes, or do we really want to look at things like defence and energy and sovereign capability for manufacture of our own stuff? Well, what's more important around here? And only the politicians can make that call. Are you saying
that Australia should pivot and start building what we need?
We should take another look at where we're going in the next 20 years, what we think the headwinds are, what we think the geopolitical landscape will look like in the Southwest Pacific, because it's going to change. We've got no show of changing any of that. No amount of diplomacy or talking is going to change what's going to happen. And it's clear what's going to happen. I mean, the signs are all out there that we're in for some pretty severe geopolitical headwinds, and we need to have an excellent deterrence capability ourselves. But further to that...
What does that look like?
Well, that looks like lots of missiles, our ships, our aircraft, and a good, strong land element for our defence.
So more troops, more army needs to be...
But it needs to go beyond that.
Yeah.
So we need two more things beyond that. One more thing beyond that is the capability to build the stuff in Australia. why can't we do it? We've got the iron ore, we've got the coal, we've got the uranium, we've got whatever we need.
Who do we buy it from?
Well, we buy it from the United States.
And then it gets shipped.
We are totally dependent on the United States if we're buying stuff from there. We bought Taipan helicopters from Europe, and they turned out to be not as good as we thought they were going to be
and
when we
then
first
look at
bought
the
them.
submarine debacle.
Well, the Collins-class submarine, we're supposed to have 6 of those. We've got 1 and we can't keep it in the water 24/7 because we can't get the crews for it.
But the ones that we're buying, not from France, but from America now.
Yeah, well, we've got to have nuclear subs. Geography tells us we've got the Indian Ocean on
We're
one
surrounded.
side and the Pacific Ocean on the other, and we need something that can go under the water and stay there, not come up and recharge its batteries every 2 weeks or whatever, or need ships to come and revettle it. Those nuclear subs can create their own oxygen, create sometimes even their own
So
food.
your message is build it. Build it here.
We need to make as much of that stuff as we can in Australia because when the chips are down and we lose our supply chain for these things, we're going to be in real strife.
Yeah.
And
like you say, if something detrimental like a nuclear or some kind of attack on the US happens, that's going to be their focus. And then where are we?
Exactly
and look at our
that.
neighbours over the water here.
Well, precisely that. So the other thing we need to do is make sure that when we do deals with defence, that they are sustainable deals. Now, we did some bad deals during the Vietnam War. We bought Swedish planes, and the Swedes didn't like the Vietnam War, so they forbade us from flying their planes, which we bought for the army, into Vietnam. And they were the best planes in the world, Pilatus Porters. They were the best planes money could buy. But they're useless if they can't support the army when the things are hot for the infantrymen forward. We also bought the Carl Gustaf 84mm anti-tank weapon, which is a brilliant tank bunker buster, as well as a tank buster, right? We weren't allowed to even buy their rounds if we were going to take them off to Vietnam, and they're useless if we're going to fire them at Holsworthy training range, but we can't fire them in Vietnam. What's the point of having them at all?
The same body with the same head. We can't have all of these different ideas coming together and then it not working out.
Exactly that.
Everything needs to work together.
It's got to be consolidated.
Yeah.
And so we've got to work towards that. That's not the job of our generals and our admirals, air marshals.
Is it politicians?
That's got to be our politicians.
Right.
They're the ones who decide where the Australian taxpayers' dollars going to go.
In defence,
And they're the ones on whom the total responsibility for getting us prepared for what's coming in 20 years needs to be decided now.
Yeah.
Don't wait for 20 years, too
look,
late.
Other countries, like look at China. They think 50 years in the future. They think 100 years. Where do we think? 4, 5, 10? I don't even know.
Election to election.
That's right.
And that's not good enough.
Whereas we need to think future for our generations.
Absolutely. So, it's not the top end of defence that needs to do any of the rethinking. It really needs to be our political leaders who will spot for us.
Yeah.
But they need the support of the Australian people. So if we're apathetical or we're very left-leaning or something that we want China to come and take us.
Anti-war. I'm not sure that. I mean, none of us are pro-war. Nobody's pro-war.
Nobody wants to go to war.
Of course not.
No.
But we are pro-defence of Australia and our Australian way of life.
Absolutely. We don't want Australia to become a dystopia.
No.
And people don't understand that dystopia is where the government controls everything you do, where you go, what you buy, how you do it, and control your entire life.
Yeah.
And what's more, they have a nasty little group of people called the secret police. And those secret police can be your next door neighbour or a member of your family.
Who has the secret police?
Sorry?
Who has the secret police?
Well, Iran's got them. I believe Pakistan's got them.
And they could live here?
Russia's definitely got them.
They could live here?
Well, I don't think we've got secret police.
Okay.
I'm pretty sure we do not.
Okay. Are you saying in those countries, they have secret police living in suburbia watching people and reporting back? I get it.
So if you're sitting in a coffee shop and you criticise the leader or you say something against the government, you've got someone who's going to come and get you at 2 o'clock in the morning and drag you off to re-education centre to tell you how to think.
George, we don't want that.
We don't want that.
We don't want that.
That's dystopia. We don't want it.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to fight against.
Yeah.
That's what I fought against. That's what my father fought against. My grandfather fought against dystopia. We didn't want it. The Nazis or the extreme communists, we don't want their dystopia in Australia.
Yeah.
And that's why we've got to be prepared to stand up on 2 feet and say, if you want to come here, we don't really want to change our freedoms, our liberty, to be totally controlled by something that's going to come out of some foreign capital. We want to be able to decide our way forward ourselves.
Yeah.
And we're going to fight to make sure that happens. Now, if you reckon that's worthwhile, get in a uniform and learn how to do it. If you don't reckon it's well, then you roll over and play dead, because that's what you're going to get.
Yeah.
And that's where we're coming from.
And then there's regret.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then we can't go back in time.
No.
And prepare.
Once it's gone. It's gone. Yeah.
Oh, George,
So, yeah.
can I just say thank you so much? Your
You're
service,
welcome. Yeah.
the man you
you're
are
welcome.
today, coming to speak to me, we could talk for hours. In fact, I want to get you on again. After
Okay.
this book comes
You're-
out,
you're on.
I've got you back on this couch.
You've got me.
Oh, George, thank you. Thank